Hey everyone, welcome back for some more best of 3 standard content. And this is a deck that I am very excited and very proud to be showing you because this has taken a lot of work. So my last video showcased an Esper Pixie build that really I had been working on since the release of Edge of Eternities. The thing is, I haven't only been working on an Esper build, I have also been working on an Orzhov build. What kind of spurred me into doing that was the fact that the Esper build, when I was really building it for the first 3, 4, maybe 5 days of the season, just didn't feel as good as I wanted it to. The fact that it was 3 colors in there seemed to be part of the reason why that deck wasn't really working that well for me. So instead I started to brew an Orzhov build. I have gone through so many iterations of this Orzhov Pixie deck. In its current state, I definitely prefer this to the Esper build. And the results speak for themselves. Take a look at this record. I have made multiple copies of this deck to keep trying different combinations of cards. That first deck that you see on the right that went 2 and 2, that was an earlier build that I returned to once I was done with the Esper build. Everything else to the left includes the main revisions that I have made, just with a few changes in which cards I was using here and there. And you can just see how well this deck has been performing for me. Before I get into the details of what you see in front of you, I want to say a few more things about the Esper build. The Esper build seems like it should be a tier 1 deck without any question. You get to bounce all these spells, you get to replay them, you get to do all this fun stuff, right? It's a very fun kind of deck to play. It's like you're having a good time, like you're in a party or something like that. The thing is, I actually believe that that deck is noticeably more anemic than people are realizing because it doesn't really have a good way to close games except for Cosmic Grand Zenith. That is it. That is the one mega powerful card in that deck, and if your opponents just keep dealing with it, then you don't really have anything to punch through and close the game. It feels like the Esper build just has a lot of fluff and does a lot of dilly-dallying without actually getting the job done. That is not the case with this Orzhov build. This Orzhov build means business. So let me stop dilly-dallying myself here and get into the actual deck. So I'm going to start by talking about the core of the deck over here, similar to what I did in my Esper Pixie build. The first card I'm going to talk about is Optimistic Scavenger. This is one of the 1-drops that I was seriously considering and also trying in my Esper build, but it didn't work. And it didn't work because I couldn't get this trigger to happen often enough. However, in this deck, there is a total of 15 enchantments. And not only that, there's a few rooms that you can unlock, and I know you know which card I'm talking about. I'm going to get to that card a little later. She works in tandem with the other primary 1-drop of this deck, which is Spiteful Hexmage. Spiteful Hexmage is one of the other 1-drop creatures in my Esper build. Hexmage by himself is not a very powerful card, because if you just play him, then you have to put this Cursed Roll token on him, and now he has a base power toughness 1/1. But if you have another creature that already has a base power and toughness of 1/1, that is a good target to put the roll token on. In this build, Optimistic Scavenger has base power and toughness 1/1. And not only that, the roll token is an enchantment. So you play 4 Hex Mages, that's 4 enchantments. If you have Optimistic Scavenger on the field, once you play this, your Hex Mage is going to be a 3/2 because you can just put the roll token on Scavenger, and then Scavenger is going to trigger. You can put a +1/+1 counter on Scavenger or a +1/+1 counter on Hex Mage, and now Hex Mage is a 4/3. It's a very powerful start to a game. Next card I'm going to talk about is Cosmic Grand Zenith. So I talked a lot about Zenith in my Esper build. Obviously, it is one of the most powerful white spells that is in Edge of Eternities and arguably the most powerful creature in this deck. To get this trigger, you have to cast 2 spells, and it can happen on the turn that Zenith actually hits the battlefield because you can follow it up with another spell. And that's what I was explaining in my Esper video, is you don't want to treat Zenith as a 3-drop. You want to treat it as a 4 or 5-drop because you want to follow it up with another spell the turn that you play it. Zenith is so powerful and so threatening that it's highly likely your opponent is going to remove it. So when you play it, if you don't follow up with another spell, you can't expect that it is still going to be on the battlefield by your next turn, unless your opponent has maybe one card in hand or no cards in hand, or they've used a bunch of their removal already, or maybe you know what's in their hand and you know that they don't have removal. Otherwise, you want to be very careful with playing this card. You want to try to double spell the turn that you actually play it. And again, the 1/1 human soldier creature tokens, really good targets for the Cursed Roll token from the Hexmage. Now, one of the things that I was saying about my Esper Pixie build is that it didn't feel like it had a lot of power outside of Zenith. Zenith was the win condition. So if your Zenith got removed and then you didn't draw another one, it was like, how am I going to close this game out? But in this build, there's something else. It is Unholy Annex. This is my favorite card from Duskmourn. We know what it does, and we know how it works. How I came to end up adding it to this deck is a little bit interesting. One of the problems that I was facing with the earlier Orzhov builds is that I was running out of cards. The Esper build can play Stock Up, the Esper build can play Cryogen Relic, right? Those are ways to keep digging through your deck, whereas the Orzhov, without the access to blue, didn't really have that. A card that I did have in here before was the Hymn of the Faller. And that proved to be pretty effective because if I triggered Void, I could get 2 cards. The thing is, I could really only do it once. There was no way for me to get it back from the graveyard because there's no Storm Chaser's Talent or anything like that. So that was just like a one-time Sign in Blood. And that was it. Every top tier mid-range deck right now has an engine. VV Cauldron is an engine. The Synthesizer is an engine. Sephiroth is an engine. Enduring Curiosity is an engine. See, all these decks have engines, so they're always able to keep generating value. And while the Synthesizer doesn't have you draw through the deck, it does have you continually make creatures. So without an engine, this Orzhov deck couldn't really keep up. And then one day I just had a revelation. The Annex. The Annex is an engine. It's an engine all by itself. And to that end, it's actually more efficient because those other engines in those other decks, they require more than one card. You need VV and Cauldron. You need Synthesizer and your other artifacts. You need Sephiroth and the other creatures that you can sacrifice, or the Umbral Caller Zealots. You need Curiosity and creatures to be able to attack and do damage. You see what I'm saying? The Annex is an engine all by itself. And furthermore, because it's an enchantment, it works with Scavenger. And not only that, it's a room enchantment. So Scavenger can trigger twice off of my Unholy Annex when I open up the Ritual Chamber. This was the missing piece. This deck is jam-packed with value. Every single card has a purpose. Every single card is useful. So if you're drawing more cards, you're drawing something of value. You're not drawing fluff. You get that much closer to your next Zenith. You get that much closer to your next Scavenger. You get that much closer to your next interaction spell. You see what I'm saying? It's going to get you that 4th or 5th land that you're missing. The value that this Annex brings to this deck is almost more than what it does in some other decks. It's also another win condition alongside Zenith. There have been so many games that I have won because of the Annex, but that's not even the full thing. There's more. There's a bigger thing with the Annex. I'm going to get to that in just a little bit. The next thing I want to talk about is this column right here of all these creatures. And the one that is drawing a lot of attention here is of course Pixie. And what you will notice is that there's only 3 copies of Pixie in this deck. And there's also only 3 copies of Kieran. Furthermore, I laid these out very intentionally. I said the core of the deck was over here. And you notice I didn't include Pixie and Kieran in the core of this deck. How can I possibly do that? It sounds insane. What am I even doing here? What am I even doing playing a Pixie deck with only 3 copies of Pixie and 3 copies of Kieran? It doesn't make any sense. I will explain. Pixie and Kieran themselves are not extremely powerful cards. They're just cards to keep allowing you to have value, to keep replaying your stuff. But they are not how you close games, and they are not how you win games. They're also very vulnerable creatures. They die very easily to fire magic. They die very easily to Torch the Tower. Other flyers, if they have 2 power, they can't get through that. And Kieran only has 1 toughness, so Kieran can't even get through a 1/1 flyer. After I had made this change to add the Annex to the deck, I started to lean a little bit more heavily onto it. And I found that as I leaned more heavily onto it, it was actually proving more and more effective. And furthermore, the really telling sign was that there were a number of games when I was just holding Pixie or Kieran in my hand, and I didn't play them. I didn't play them because they weren't conducive to victory in that game. That felt no good. That felt like wasted space. If I have a Pixie in my hand and I'm not playing it, what the heck am I doing? It sounds crazy, but that's just the truth. It's the hard truth that I had to accept. I was holding these cards in my hand sometimes and I was not playing them. It didn't make any sense for me to have 4 copies of each one. What I then realized after trimming one of each is that they're not the core of the deck. It was this huge, dramatic shift in my whole perspective of how this deck works. I don't even consider it an Orzhov Pixie deck. This is just Orzhov Midrange. Pixie and Kieran have been reduced from the superstar roles in the spotlight to role players, supporters. And it is so much better. They are very useful as role players because now they can potentially bounce some of my interactions so that I can play it again. But Kieran is actually a bit more useful in this deck because if I bounce a token, I draw a card. I have all these cursed roll tokens produced by Hexmaze that are triggering Scavenger to give +1/+1 counters, right? Pretty good target for Kieran to be able to bounce and draw a card. Kieran can also be used to potentially save a creature, so I can bounce something back to my hand to save it from removal. But I said that there was something else with the Annex, right? There was some other piece of value there that I didn't mention. Do you see it? I want to see if those of you watching this video can piece together what it is. It uses Pixie and Kieran. So, what if I have my Annex going and then I open up my Ritual Chamber and I get my 6/6 demon, but then my demon gets removed? Well, now the Annex is just sitting there. I mean, sure, I could draw cards, but I'm going to keep losing life. I can't open up the Ritual Chamber again. Well, what if I bounce it? I bounce the Annex back to my hand, and then I replay the Ritual Chamber, and I get my demon back. It is one of the most evil things I have done in Magic. I can just bounce it. I could even potentially bounce it at instant speed. And then the next turn, I'm opening up that Ritual Chamber again, and that demon is coming right back. It is crazy. It's honestly kind of scary. It's like this presence that you try to get rid of and you can't. So that is the real mega value that Pixie and Kieran bring to this deck. They are the failsafe. If I'm about to close out a game, but my opponent has the answer to my 6/6 demon, they have the answer to my Annex, guess what? I have an answer for your answer. So now I'm going to talk about some creatures that are a little less exciting than that, but I have 3 copies of Deep Cavern Bat in here. What I found is that even with the Annex, even with the Pixie and Kieran taking on supportive roles, right, and all this stuff, it was still a little bit difficult sometimes for me to keep disrupting my opponent enough in a manner that they couldn't fully deal with what I was presenting to them, especially against control decks. I not only put copies of Duress in the sideboard, but I also put copies of Deep Cavern Bat in the sideboard. But then I realized, wait a minute, why don't I just play Bat in this deck? Bat is really freaking good. It is just a lot of value for one simple 2-mana creature. And really, playing 3 copies of this Bat has just proven so useful. It is not part of the core. It is not one of the centerpieces. That's why I'm not running 4 copies of it. But as a utility card, it is really, really excellent. Last creature I want to talk about here is one of my personal favorites, Sage of the Skies. So I talked a lot about Sage of the Skies in my Esper video. And what I said is that really any deck that is playing this kind of Pixie, Kieran, bounce type thing, whether it's Esper or Orzhov, really should be running Sage of the Skies. And I firmly stand by that. It's so easy to double spell with this deck. I mean, Cosmic Grand Zenith is based around double spelling, right? Well, now you can double spell with Sage of the Skies. And now you have 2/3 flyers with lifelink. But it goes deeper than that, because what I was explaining in my Esper video is that you can bounce the non-token, right? The non-token version of Sage of the Skies, you can bounce it back to your hand, and now you can play it again. And guess what? It's the second spell that you're casting that turn. So now you can have 2 more Sages. Seriously, this card is being slept on in these decks. Pretty much always overperforms for me whenever I play it. Now I'm going to talk about the interaction. This is taking, oh god, this is taking a long time to kind of figure out. So I have 2 copies of Seamrip. You'll notice how I don't have copies of Tragic Trajectory. Why am I not running Tragic Trajectory in a Pixie bounce deck? The thing is, once Pixie and Kieran took on a supportive role and I was only running 6 copies of them in total, it was a little bit harder to trigger Void. And if you can't trigger Void, then Seamrip is absolutely much better removal than Tragic Trajectory. Furthermore, Seamrip is an enchantment, so guess what? It triggers Optimistic Scavenger. So having an Optimistic Scavenger and a Hex Mage on the field early, like in the first 2 turns, and then being able to play Seamrip alongside that, man, it is a really strong start to some of these games. Sometimes bouncing Seamrip is actually good. If you exile a token with it, well, now you can certainly bounce it and replay it because there's nothing underneath it. Sometimes you exile something early, like a Llanowar Elves or something like that, but then later on, your opponent plays a different permanent with mana value 2 or less that's more threatening than that. Well, now I'm just going to bounce the Seamrip, give you back your Llanowar Elves because I don't care, and then I'm going to take your stronger thing. 1 copy of Bitter Triumph in here, and I found that this has been really useful. For a while, I didn't have this copy of Bitter Triumph in here. I instead had Sheltered by Ghosts because that is an enchantment that triggers Optimistic Scavenger, right? Sheltered by Ghosts actually has a bit of a weakness in this deck, though, because most of the creatures are pretty weak. And Torch the Tower is only 1 mana, so if you have to pay a ward 2 on a 1 mana spell, I mean, that's not a big deal. There's also the prevalence of Nowhere to Run right now in Standard, and that just gets around the ward anyway. And again, it's -3/-3, and not a lot of my creatures can survive -3/-3, right? That being said, I do have a copy of Sheltered by Ghosts in the sideboard, because sometimes it is a very effective thing to put in the deck if your opponent doesn't have those really cheap removal spells. I found that the Bitter Triumph is better because it not only gets rid of creatures, but it also gets rid of planeswalkers. So it's very good in the matchup against Dimir midrange. 2 copies of Momentum Breaker. You don't typically want to run more than 2 copies of Momentum Breaker in the main deck, because at that point you're kind of running the risk that it's not really providing much value, because there are a lot of decks that have more than 1 creature on the battlefield at a time, and if you're just playing Momentum Breakers, it's like, well, now I can't remove the specific thing that I want to remove. 3 copies of Nowhere to Run. So again, as I said in my Esper video, 4 copies of Nowhere to Run felt like it was too much, and the reason why is because there are just too many creatures in Standard right now that have toughness greater than 3. And furthermore, many of them can come down on turn 3, like Cosmic Grand Zenith, Preacher, Sentinel of a Nameless City, Nova Hellkite, right? And then there are many 4 and 5 mana creatures that just have toughness greater than 3, and now your Nowhere to Run is just not going to kill them. So I felt that when I was having 4 copies of Nowhere to Run in my Esper deck, I would be holding it in my hand too often without being able to use it. Last piece of interaction is 1 copy of Shoot the Sheriff. Just kill the big bad creature that doesn't die to Nowhere to Run or that you can't target with Momentum Breaker, right? So having 1 copy of Shoot the Sheriff is highly effective. Now there's a card missing from this main deck list that I did include in my Esper build and that I said was an overperforming card. That card is Elegy Acolyte. So why do I not have Elegy Acolytes in this Orzhov build? I actually did. In pretty much almost every iteration before the one that you're seeing before you, I did have a copy of Elegy Acolyte in the main deck. The thing is, it was slightly competing with Unholy Annex, and what I found is that Unholy Annex is just better. And again, because I'm not triggering Void as often with less copies of Pixie and Kieran and no access to Fear of Isolation, I wasn't able to get that 2/2 robot token as often. I still think Elegy Acolyte is a card that is being very slept on, and I still think that it's very powerful in the Esper Pixie build. There's another card missing from this deck list that I have tried running in multiple iterations, and it's actually a card that I forgot to mention in my Esper Pixie build that I was also trying to run in that deck and proved to not be as effective. That card is Light Stall Inquisitor. it seems like it would be an excellent one drop in either deck, right? Because you play it, now your opponent has to exile something from their hand, and then you can bounce it, and then you can replay it, and they have to exile something else. You know, you can do that in the first 2 turns of the game, and they've exiled 2 cards. So how is that not a good card to add? The thing is, Lightstall Inquisitor is mostly played in like white weenie decks, and it's really valuable there because those decks get off to an aggressive start. And if you're able to disrupt your opponent's hand in the first 2 turns of the game and also get off to an aggressive start, now you're actually kind of compounding your advantage. With these kind of bounce decks, these mid-rangey decks, you're not going to get off to a strong start like that. Even in this deck with Scavenger and Hexmage potentially giving you a strong board presence in the first few turns, it's not enough to really push the advantage. So sure, you get to exile 2 things from their hand, but you're not applying enough pressure to be able to finish them off before they can restabilize. I really thought when I was looking through the cards and Edge of Eternities when it first released that I thought Lightstall Inquisitor was going to be an easy addition to these kinds of decks and prove to be highly effective. That is not the case. It has not proven to be as effective as I thought it would be. So now I'm going to talk about the lands. It is a little bit refreshing to not have to try to worry about 3 different colors in a mid-range deck that tries to get going a little bit early, which the Esper Pixie build does try to do. It's just kind of hard to do that sometimes when you're working with 3 colors. The Orzhov build makes it very consistent and very easy to make some plays within the first 3 turns of the game. I have 4 copies of all of the dual lands, so the Vers, the Courtyard, and then the Godless Shrine. And then I have some copies of the tapped lands, Restless Fortress and Shadowy Backstreet. That Surveil is really, really useful. You can Surveil before you draw a card with Sunpearl Kirin if you're going to bounce the roll token from Hexmage, or you can also just play it to Surveil before you draw your card with Unholy Annex. Turn 1 on this deck is a turn that is safe to play a tapped land usually. You don't always have to start with a Seam Rip or start with a Scavenger or certainly don't have to start with a Hexmage. So turn 1 is usually okay to play a tapped land. And furthermore, turn 3 is actually usually an okay turn to play a tapped land. Because turn 3, you're not going to play Zenith. You're not going to play Sage of the Skies either. You could drop Unholy Annex, but maybe you already have enough cards in your hand. You don't need to play this just yet. So instead, on turn 3, you're probably just playing a 2-mana spell anyway. Playing a tapped land on turn 3 normally doesn't really disrupt your curve. If you have a tapped land, it could even be a Concealed Courtyard after you've already got the 2 other lands in play. Well, a tapped land is a pretty good piece to discard with Bitter Triumph. Furthermore, the Annex really does let you dig and churn through the deck so that maybe you don't have to worry about playing that tapped land because you're going to get an untapped land after a couple turns or whatever with the Annex. It's also nice to be able to play Soulstone Sanctuary because it's only a 2-color deck, right? So sure, you can play Sanctuary in here. The Sanctuary is also a demon. There's 25 lands in here, which really does feel like the right number. If you flood a little bit, you'll probably be able to get through that flood with Unholy Annex, unless it's like really bad and it's like, 5 land draws in a row, which is a little bit unlikely. And not only that, look at this even split. The same number of access to white as black. The cost is evenly split between the 2 colors. I pretty much never have any problems casting the things that I want to cast in this deck. I'll talk about the sideboard next, so I have 1 more copy of Seam Rip in case I'm going up against an aggressive deck that has a lot of cheap things, or against VV Cauldron. 2 copies of Duress to go up against control decks. 1 copy of Exercise, also very good against VV Cauldron, pretty good against the unit decks as well. Also pretty good against the artifact decks. 2 copies of Rest in Peace. So these actually provide a bit more value here than they do in the Esper build because Rest in Peace is an enchantment. That's going to trigger Scavenger. Definitely a much better piece to have in this build as opposed to Ghost Vacuum. 1 copy of Sheltered by Ghosts. So I have 1 copy of Sheltered by Ghosts in here instead of the 1 extra copy of Nowhere to Run. Sheltered by Ghosts is better in this deck compared to the Esper deck because it triggers Optimistic Scavenger. The Esper deck doesn't run Optimistic Scavenger. 3 copies of Tiny Bones joins up. So this was not a card that appeared in the Esper build. I did try it in the Esper build. I tried it in the main deck. I also tried it in the main deck of this deck. I found that running it in the main deck really wasn't that useful because your opponent just gets to decide what they're going to discard. So they'll just discard their weakest creature or the weakest spell, whatever, hold on to their strongest thing, and now they're just going to slam their strongest thing anything, and then you're just going to get wrecked. But this goes in against control decks because really the nowhere to run against a control deck is not going to do anything. So typically against control decks, the 2 duresses will replace the 2 seam rips, and then the 3 tiny bones will replace the nowhere to run. Moreover, I'm replacing an enchantment with a different enchantment, so that can trigger Optimistic Scavenger. And then these are also decent targets to bounce with Pixie and Kieran if I want my opponent to keep discarding cards. 2 copies of Voice of Victory. These also go in against control decks typically. And what I'll do is I'll sideboard out something else. I might sideboard out like 2 copies of Hexmage because he doesn't really provide that much value in a control deck that's just going to sweep you anyway or whatever, right? It's definitely better to be able to prevent the control player from casting spells on your turn. But I also sideboarded in some other instances, and you're going to see an interesting case that happened in one of the matches in which I did sideboard it in, and it wasn't against a control deck. 1 more copy of Bitter Triumph. This is mostly for planeswalkers, but it can also be for like super big creatures if my opponent's playing just like a really big kind of stompy deck where my nowhere to runs and seam rips and stuff aren't really going to work. 1 more copy of Shoot the Sheriff, pretty much for the same reason. If my opponent is playing big stompy things but still has some early things, then I'll keep in the seam rips and stuff, but I might have this replace Momentum Breaker or one of the copies of Nowhere to Run or something. And then 1 more copy of Sage of the Skies. This guy will pretty much go in if I'm going up against an aggressive deck. If I'm going up against an aggressive deck, then I will trim 1 copy of Annex just because I don't want to run the risk of draining myself of more life if my opponent's already hitting me. So then instead, I'll put in an extra copy of Sage for some more lifelink. So that is the deck, and now I'm going to move on to the gameplay with the commentary. I've got 3 matches for you, and these really are some very interesting things. I was really hoping to go up against a control player so that I could show that off, but unfortunately it just didn't happen. You know, I played like I think 6 or 7 matches, and I didn't get matched up with a control player, unfortunately. You're not going to get to see that, but really, there's interesting stuff coming. So I hope you enjoy the gameplay. Alright, so here's my opening hand for the first game of the first match. It really doesn't look that good. It's not that I do actually have things I can play. I can play Optimistic Scavenger, I can play Seam Rip, and if I get a land, I can play these removal spells. But I really just didn't want to risk being off to such a slow start, even though I was on the draw, and I had a better chance to get a land, seeing 2 draws, but really I just didn't feel comfortable keeping that hand. This hand certainly looks better, and really the only thing that I'm kind of debating here is I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep the 2 nowhere to runs and then just ditch one of the Bleach Bone Verges. I certainly wouldn't ditch the Restless Fortress because then I would only have 2 black sources, right, with no white source. But I was debating not ditching this nowhere to run because I'm on the draw, so I could potentially draw a land, or the turn after that I could potentially draw a land, or the turn after that I could potentially draw a land, right? So I did have a fair amount of chances here to get the 3rd land, and I was tempted to keep the removal. So that's what I'm debating here. Obviously, I have no idea what I'm up against. If I had a bit more information about what I was playing against, then I might be able to make I would be able to make a better decision. But as it is, you know, just keep the lands, or else I can't. Like, if I don't hit a land, then I'm never going to be able to play that Annex, right? So turns out that it's Izzet Prowess here, and I got the 4th land anyway, so that's the way it goes, right? So I'm just thinking of how I want to start this. You know, if I start with the Scavenger, then I can throw out my nowhere to run and potentially my Annex, and then Scavenger is going to get kind of big. Scavenger will be a 3/3. So that's what I'm debating here. It seems a little weird to spend this much time trying to figure out your first turn of the game. But honestly, I just felt I felt like I needed to be careful here, you know. The Izzet Prowess deck can definitely still pop off. And I wasn't sure if I was going to need this Scavenger on the field early or not, because it could also just get torched, right? And then to that, it might not be that bad, because then it just eats a torch. So this is as expected. They play the Planisphere, and then they get the Prowess trigger. That's pretty much what I thought they were going to do. Now they're going to get in with the Otter. And I wasn't, you know, now I'm just thinking I can nowhere to run that thing, nowhere to run the token, because it's just going to get bigger and bigger, right? Getting a +1/+1 counter every time a non-creature spell is played. Drawing Sage of the Skies was a very welcome sight, so now I was glad that I held on to my Optimistic Scavenger. I did think for a moment there of playing the Godless Shrine tapped just so I wouldn't take the 2 damage and then running out the Scavenger, but I didn't see much value in doing that. So my opponent plays an Opt, and now the triggers happen. And I'm pausing here because I was like, should I know where to run this thing right now? Because there is potentially that I can miss my opportunity. If my opponent finds a land with that Opt, then they can play the land, and then they could play another instant spell, and if I try to know where to run, they can play another instant spell, and that thing will be a 4/4. So because they didn't have blue mana available, you see how the Verge is only red? I knew that they wouldn't be able to counter my nowhere to run, so I decided to do it right then. And then they just passed a turn anyway, so they missed their 3rd land drop, which was a little bit lucky for me. So now I can safely run out this Annex. Again, no blue mana available, so it's not going to get countered. And now I'm in really good shape. I can play my Godless Shrine. I can play Pixie to bring back my nowhere to run. I can play Sage. I can play Zenith. Just tons of options in my hand. This hand is just gorgeous at this point. This is like the exact kind of hand and the exact kind of board state that I also have my 5th land, so now I can open up the Ritual Chamber, right, at the next turn if I want to. This is just beautiful. And this is why I love this deck. Look at all these things. Again, Sage of the Skies just showing so much value. The reason why I decided to play Sage here instead of going for the double spell with Zenith is A, when I double spell with Zenith, I can put +1/+1 counters on my Sages. I'll gain more life. And B, I was already down to 10 and I would go down to 8 with the trigger from the Annex. So I felt like it was important for me to be able to attack on my next turn and then try to gain some life back. Now they do remove a Sage, not so bad, because that Obliterating Bolt could have been used on my Zenith instead, right? So this is actually the better alternative here, even though my opponent's attacking for 3 and I can't really block here. I'm going to go down to 5. This is still better than what the alternative could have been. So now look at that. I drew a Spiteful Hexmage. And not only that, I got the Seam Rip off of the trigger from the Annex. So this could actually be huge because I can Seam Rip one of the Otters. I can Pixie the Seam Rip and then get the other Otter, right? That's what I'm thinking of doing here. So you see what's happening? I'm going to get one of the Otters. And then I'm going to put the counter on my Sage. Then I'm going to play Pixie, get back my Seam Rip, and get the other Otter. And then put another counter on Sage. This is a big turn for me. So now I can get in there. I did debate playing that Hexmage, but I decided no, let me hold it to double spell. But now I gain 4 life. I hit my opponent for 4, and then I get my card off the Annex, and now next turn I can double spell with Zenith still. Just insane value. Insane value from the Sage of the Skies. Insane value from the Annex. This is just exactly what I was saying in the deck tech. And my opponent, look, missed a land drop there. They had to play sleight of hand to find their land. So now I'm off to the races here, right? I'm going to play Zenith. I'm going to play Hexmage. And then I'm going to get my my trigger here, my +1/+1 counters. And then I'm going to put the roll token on the Scavenger and then put another counter on. This is crazy, right? How much I was able to turn this game around. And now next turn I can just, and look at this. I drew a nowhere to run off of the Annex. And I'm thinking, well, I'm just going to fire this off because my opponent didn't have a counter spell. They would have played it. Well, I guess they could have had Spell Pierce, right? Just insane. You are seeing it firsthand. The value of the Annex, the value of the Sage of the Skies, the value of the Scavenger. Just nuts. Those like 3 turns that I had in a row there were just insane. Huge value turns. So, against Izzet Prowess. I certainly wasn't going to play the Momentum Breakers here because they can just like sack the Otter tokens or something. I wouldn't get much value from that. So it's certainly going to put in the Seam Rip though, because I can take the Otter tokens and then nothing's under the Seam Rip. I can play it again, right? I can take the Planisphere. I can take the Storm Chaser's Talent. I can take the token that's made from the job select on the Planisphere. I can do so much with the Seam Rip here. And Exercise seems like a good option as well. Targets the Storm Chaser's Talent, targets the Planisphere, right? And then I wasn't really sure what else to do. Nowhere to Run still seemed good. Deep Cavern Bat still seems pretty good. But you notice how I'm trimming one of these? So the reason why I'm trimming one of these is because I was kind of thinking I should probably put in the other Sage because they don't really have that many flyers. So I can seemingly go over the top of them. And then not only that, you know, again, they might be hitting me kind of hard if they're on the play. So I might need to get that life back. Now, the other thing that I was considering here, I was like, this doesn't feel like enough. I can't really explain to you why I had this feeling, but it felt like it wasn't enough. So you see what I do here? I trim the Deep Cavern Bat completely and I put in 2 Voice of Victories. If you think about it, that's really good because so many of their spells are instant spells, and these Izzet Prowess decks are going to try to do it on your turn because that's when they hold up their instant spells and then they do it on your turn. Well, with Voice of Victory, you can't do that anymore. And not only that, Voice of Victory, and it can't get torched as easily as the bat, all right? Because you have to do 3 damage to it instead of 2. So they would have to sacrifice their talent or a tree creature, or, you know, they have to bargain the Torch the Tower. So that's why I put the Voice of Victories. And look, showing up in my opening hand here, Voice of Victory. So this opening hand is a little bit sketch because I have things that I can do, and I have really good ways to respond to what my opponent is going to be playing. I just need the land. I don't even necessarily need the 3rd land. I just need the 2nd land. So it was a bit of a risky keep, but just look at what I'm holding. I'm holding the Seam Rip. I'm holding the Voice of Victory. I'm holding the Shoot the Sheriff, right? I got just great stuff. See, look, there's the Otter token. I'm just going to Seam Rip that thing right away. Now, look, I messed up. I messed up. I accidentally played it tapped. It was just literally clicking the wrong thing. I felt so stupid. Yeah, I just messed up. I clicked the wrong thing. I didn't pay the 2 life. Unfortunate there, but at least I drew another land. It is a tapped land, Shadowy Backstreet. Now, this isn't so bad because I can at least surveil. And I didn't necessarily need the next land to come untapped on this turn. But look at this. It's the other Shadowy Backstreet. So this was a little bit dicey, but I couldn't not get my 3rd land. And what I was also thinking is, you know what, it doesn't really matter if this Shadowy Backstreet comes in tapped because I can play this Seam Rip, get the Auto token, play Nurturing Pixie, get the Seam Rip back, and replay it, and I can get the other Auto token, right? So that's why I didn't mind keeping the next Backstreet on top. Screaming Nemesis is definitely scary, but hey, I have the answer, right? I have a Shoot the Sheriff. Now I actually have some options. You know, I don't necessarily have to do the Nurturing Pixie Seam Rip play. I could just remove the Screaming Nemesis, and this nowhere to run on top. At first, I was thinking this is great, but I was also thinking, oh man, I need my 4th land to be able to double spell with Zenith, because once I get rid of this Screaming Nemesis, I can seemingly turn the game over. All right, I can seemingly turn the game over if I can double spell with Zenith. It was really... This was tough, man. It was really tough to put that nowhere to run in the yard, but it just... I really wanted that 4th land because I knew if I could just get rid of the Screaming Nemesis, because I can, then next turn I can double spell with Zenith, and now I have a huge advantage. That's basically what I'm thinking here. I'm thinking I do need to shoot the Sheriff, this Screaming Nemesis, and I'm also thinking, well, I don't really want to worry about a counterspell like, you know, Spell Pierce or something like that, so I might have to do this now. That's what I'm thinking here, and ultimately that's just what I decided. They only have 3 cards in hand, but still, if they have a Spell Pierce, you know, it's just... So they play Thundering Falls. And then I also just checked the graveyard there to see what was in there. And look who shows up. It's another Screaming Nemesis. So now I'm like, well, man, I got rid of my nowhere to run, but then look at this. I get another one. Dude, Magic is just dumb sometimes. So... I can run out the Scavenger here because I can double spell with Pixie and Zenith next turn. So my opponent got a little bit lucky drawing a second Screaming Nemesis, or having a second Screaming Nemesis in hand. But then I also got a little bit lucky in ditching my nowhere to run and then getting another one. So, you know, it goes both ways. I'm also getting a little bit unlucky here because I'm not hitting lands, right? So it's a give and take, you know. Definitely was some good luck on my opponent's side, but some good luck on my side as well. Torch the Tower on Scavenger, and they're going to sacrifice one of these Storm Chaser's talents to be able to scry. And they kept something on top. Now they're going to level it up, and they're going to take something back. And I thought they were going to reach for the Torch the Tower, but they didn't. They reached for the Obliterating Bolt. So now this is potentially a little bit scary. At least I got my 4th land. And what I'm thinking now is I have to protect Cosmic Grand Zenith. I was thinking maybe they took the Bolt because they're preparing it for Zenith, right? That's why they took it instead of the Towards the Tower, because Zenith is my most powerful card. So if that's the case, that was really good foresight by my opponents. And really what I'm thinking here is I can still double spell, but I'm going to have to put the +1/+1 counter on just Zenith, because then Zenith will survive the Obliterating Bolt. So that's kind of what I'm considering here. I also thought maybe I can just play the Nurturing Pixie and then play the Annex. I was also thinking I could play Nurturing Pixie, get back my Seam Rip and Seam Rip the Otter, right? And then play Voice of Victory and all these things. You know, I still have tons of options, but this just felt like the right thing to do. Put a +1/+1 counter on the Zenith, get it on the field, and then I did decide to take the Seam Rip because now it's more likely that I can double spell on my next turn instead of taking the Nowhere to Run. So now I can double spell with the Seam Rip and the Unholy Annex, or Seam Rip and Voice of Victory. So look at this, it's into the Floodmaw. This was actually, and then they're going to Obliterating Bolt my Nurturing Pixie. This was actually a really bad play by my opponents. And now they have no cards in hand. This was a really, really bad play. They got in for damage, sure, but now look, you just gave me back the thing that I can double spell with. And not only that, it gets rid of your token. This was a really big misplay by my opponent, was bouncing my Zenith back to my hand and then wasting the Obliterating Bolt, because now I can just double spell with the Seam Rip and get rid of the Otter and get my human tokens. And now I have access to 6 mana and I can seemingly open up the Ritual Chamber. I was a little tempted to double spell here because I could play Voice of Victory, really good against their deck, and then play Unholy Annex. And then I would be able to double spell, put counters on everything, or make more creatures, and then I would be able to draw a card. But then I would only go down to 3 life. So, you know, Burst Lightning gets me kind of close to being dead. And really what I was thinking of is Screaming Nemesis, because if Screaming Nemesis attacks, then I'm forced to block, but then I can't gain life for the rest of the game. I'm stuck at 2 life or whatever it is. So that didn't seem so good. So instead, they already played into the Floodmaw, right? So I decided to run out my demon, my 6/6 demon. They have another Storm Chaser's Talon, which means, well, now they're going to plus it up and they're going to get there into the Floodmaw. So that's the way it goes, man. I think I made the right call, but man, they just had the answer. Not much I can do about that. So, but look at this. Look at what I drew. So, definitely a back and forth thing on this game, man. Between my opponent getting lucky, me getting lucky, right? But now I can double spell with Zenith, and I can get the Annex back with Kieran. This is exactly what I was saying in the deck tech. Kieran and Pixie take on a supportive role in this deck, where I can bounce something that I need to remove something on my opponent's side, or as a bit of a fail-safe, if my demon gets removed after I play the Annex or open up the Ritual Chamber, I can bounce it back to my hand and do it again. It is crazy. It is just so crazy that I can milk more value from this Annex and Ritual Chamber using Pixie and Kieran. So I decided just to attack with the Zenith because I'm not sure what my opponent is planning to do here. They could, you know, bounce my tokens. They could kill my Voice of Victory, and then I didn't want to leave myself so open with only having 5 life. So I decided to hold everything back. They do have an Obliterating Bolt. So that's going to trigger Prowess, and then they're going to get another Otter. And then they're going to attack. I feel like this attack was a little bit egregious. You know, I can just block with the tokens, and then I don't mind if they die. They're just fodder anyway. So now I'm certainly going to make the demon again. And look at this. A null. So that one stung. That one stung really bad. I was just like, oh no. And now it kind of made sense that they attacked with the Otters, right? That one definitely stung, getting annulled. So good play from my opponent. I did draw a Voice of Victory, and I decided to get in for an attack here since my opponent only has 2 attackers. And I was worried about a Screaming Nemesis, but I could block it with the Voice of Victory if necessary. Though I was really thinking of just blocking the Otters. And you notice how I didn't attack with the Zenith? I didn't attack with the Zenith because it's a better blocker against these Otters if Prowess triggers. So I decided just to get in with the Sun Pearl Kieran. That little bit of extra damage would have made a difference. And boom, I get my second Annex. So a bunch of luck on my opponent's side, but then some luck on my side as well. And then they scoop. Very entertaining game. against the Izzet Prowess. And really sideboarding the Voice of Victory made a big difference. All right, so here is my opening hand for the first game of the second match. It looks pretty good. I can potentially do my combo here with Optimistic Scavenger and Spiteful Hexmage, or I can just play a bat and then save one of them to double spell with Zenith. I was just kind of thinking about, you know, how do I want to play this, but it wasn't, I don't think it was necessary for me to put that much consideration in. You know, I wasn't sure what I was playing against, and lo and behold, it is Gruul Delirium. Now I'm kind of thinking of what I want to do here. You know, it seemed better to just play this tapped. The beastie can't attack yet. If they play a Wicker Folk, so be it. You know, I wouldn't be able to like block it or kill it anything anyway, right? And they play a Breakout, and it is Wicker Folk, so that would have had haste regardless. Now I have some options. I can do my combo here with Scavenger and Spiteful Hexmage, although I wasn't sure about that. It felt better to just run out the bat and see what I was dealing with. And they're showing an Overprotect, a Dredger's Insight, and a C-Note Scout. I think taking that Overprotect actually might have been a little bit of a mistake, because the Dredger's Insight could have potentially gotten them Delirium. Granted, they got Delirium anyway because they got a little bit lucky with another beastie on top. So then that's an artifact creature, and now they have Delirium, right? So I'm in bad shape. They're going to hit me for a ton of damage here, and I'm certainly not going to block. The only saving grace that I really have is that I can potentially double spell with Sage of the Skies, or I can play my Scavenger, play my Hexmage, and then put a counter on the bat. That's kind of the lane that I was thinking here. I think in retrospect, I probably shouldn't have done this because I wasn't necessarily dead on the next turn. I think I should have potentially just put the Hexmage down by itself and then put the roll token on the bat and then just leave the Hexmage as a blocker, and then I could double spell on the next turn with Sage of the Skies. I think that might have been the better play. At the same time, my opponent just got off to a really good start. There wasn't too much I could do here, so they're just... I'm taking a pummeling, right? It's just the way it is. So I'm going to at least block the Wicker Folk, get the strongest creature out of there. And now it's going to be harder for me to double spell with the Sage of the Skies, and that's not going to do it, right? So, drawing some Proc here and there was not very good. Again, I think it would have been better to... I didn't draw a land anyway, so I wouldn't have had 4 lands to double spell to cast the Sage, but I still think it might have been better to just play the Hexmage and hold back the Scavenger. Now what I'm thinking here is, well, I can play Sage, and at least I have a lifelinker on the field. I could also play Zenith, which is a slightly better blocker, but it doesn't really do much in this situation because fear of missing out, with Delirium, there's going to be 2 attack phases. So at least in this case, I'm not dead, but unfortunately, they hit a Wicker Folk. So now I am dead. If it wasn't Wicker Folk, if it wasn't a haste creature, I would have survived this turn because I would have been able to gain life off of both the bat and the Sage, and then I could block twice with the Sage. That would have saved me, but with the Wicker Folk coming down, it's too much damage. Unfortunately, this was it. They get the Overprotect back, and then I can block with the Sage, but then they have the mana to cast Overprotect. Again, there wasn't really too much I could do there. I didn't hit the land anyway, so I wouldn't have been able to play Sage. So, against Gruul Delirium, Rest in Peace certainly goes in, Seam Rip goes in. Both good ways of exiling here. And obviously, Rest in Peace exiles the whole graveyard, right? So, Bitter Triumph doesn't really feel that good in this matchup because I'm going to be taking some damage, right? I'm going to be losing some life, and if I don't have a card to discard, I don't want to have to lose more life. So, certainly putting in a Sage and putting in Sheltered by Ghosts to keep my life kind of healthy, and then trimming an Annex here is the right thing to do. Anytime I go against an aggressive deck, I trim a copy of Annex because it could potentially just lower my life even more when my life is already low. Then I'm just kind of going through some final considerations here. I need to cut 1 card. I kind of have the tools that I need to hopefully stabilize against this. I was also thinking that I want to get this Exercise in the deck So I was kind of thinking, well, maybe I can cut this, shoot the sheriff. Maybe I don't really need it. You know, nowhere to run is actually pretty good against their deck because it does prevent the hexproof from overprotect. And then also most of their creatures have 3 toughness. So if they don't cast overprotect the moment you cast nowhere to run, that creature is probably going to die. So that's kind of what I'm considering here. Certainly cutting 1 copy of Kieran makes sense because it only has 1 toughness, and with their trample, it's like, well, that's not a very good blocker, right? But keeping the bats does feel good because it's lifelink and it disrupts their hand. So this felt like a pretty good sideboard. Putting in the lifelink options and putting in the exercise as a better removal spell against this deck, and putting in the rest in peace. This is a good opening hand. 2 nowhere to runs, totally fine. If I remove too many things, my opponent could potentially get closer to Delirium, but at the same time, if I just keep removing their stuff, then they can't attack me. So really, it's not a bad thing to be a little bit liberal with the nowhere to runs here. I was thinking of that I don't need to necessarily nowhere to run right now. The only thing that can hit me is a Wicker Folk, and if a Wicker Folk hits me, so be it. I take through 3 damage. So that's why I didn't play the Godless Shrine untapped. And it's also why I decided to wait, because now I can buff up my Scavenger. And it was a Wicker Folk. You know, of course it was. So, but now I can nowhere to run, buff up my Scavenger, and then I can Pixie to get my nowhere to run back. So really, it's not so bad. I take 3 damage from the Wicker Folk, but so what? Buff my Scavenger. I can also get in for damage because the Beastie can't block yet. And then I can Pixie and get back my nowhere to run. Now, my opponent is very close to getting Delirium. But again, because I'm on the play, it's less likely that they're going to be able to cast something and have mana up for Overprotect, so I can just keep removing things over and over and over again, right? Don't have Delirium yet. They play Obliterating Bolt on my Scavenger. I actually didn't mind that at all, but it does give them Delirium, so now they can attack with the Beastie. Unfortunately, drawing Concealed Courtyard there was not very good. I did want to pay the life for the Godless Shrine because now I can double nowhere to run. So I did want to nowhere to run this Beastie to play around a Overprotect, and now the Hexproof from Overprotect will not work because nowhere to run is on the field. They could still play Overprotect just to protect their creature by giving it more toughness than 3, because it gives plus 3, but at least I can still hit it with another removal spell. So once I saw that they tapped out here, I was like, I'm definitely removing this Fear of Missing Out because they have Delirium, and Fear of Missing Out is one of the scariest creatures to leave on the battlefield if your opponent has Delirium. I was really hoping to find my Rest in Peace at this point. But really, you know, again, aggressively using these nowhere to runs, I think, wasn't a bad call at all. So, I draw a Cosmic Grand Zenith. I'm not going to play it yet because I want a double spell. And I was thinking I can at least attack with this Sanctuary and then have a blocker back. Even though I'm going to take 2 damage from the Godless Shrine. And there's another Fear of Missing Out. So this is getting a little scary because I don't have a removal spell for this one. Thankfully, I drew a Kieran, so this is really good. I can double spell with Zenith and then get my nowhere to run back. I can't remove the Fear of Missing Out right now, but I can take one of the nowhere to runs, and you saw that stick right there? There was a stick right there. There was a stick when I cast the Zenith, so I was thinking, okay, they have an Overprotect. It could also be Violent Urge. There was a Violent Urge in the graveyard, but I had a feeling that it was Overprotect. So because I had a feeling it was Overprotect, now I'm thinking very carefully about what I want to do with this Zenith trigger. Do I want to put a +1/+1 counter on everything to have more toughness? Or do I just want to make more tokens? What I was kind of thinking here is I want to try to bait out the Overprotect so that then I can pull up my nowhere to run with the Kieran, and then I can nowhere to run after the Overprotect has already happened on another turn. You know what I mean? So I was kind of hoping, well, maybe if I choose my blocks carefully, like if I block the C-Note Scout, then my opponent will be more tempted to cast the Overprotect and waste it. So that's what I was thinking there. That's why I made the 1/1 tokens instead. I technically think I have more toughness on the board now than if I did the +1/+1 counters on just the Zenith and the Nurturing Pixie. So I drew a Deep Cavern Bat. This is fantastic. I can just cast it, find out what's in my opponent's hand, right? What is that instant spell that they were holding? And instead, They scoop. So, I seemingly it wasn't overprotect, and maybe they felt that after that point the game was just over, which I think it could be. You know, I could have double spelled then, right, and put +1/+1 counters on everything, so it certainly was in my favor. So now that I'm on the draw, I'm thinking if I want to change anything here. I wasn't sure, because, you know, it obviously worked, but I was thinking I really should probably put another piece of interaction in. I was thinking Momentum Breaker, because if they just play a creature on turn 1 or turn 2 or whatever, then I can just Momentum Breaker, get rid of the thing or one of those things, and then I can bounce it back and then do it again. But I was also thinking, you know, in that last game, they had 3 creatures on the field towards the end of the game. And if I play Momentum Breaker, it's like, well, how much value am I really getting, right? So, see, that's what I'm doing here. I'm checking the battlefield. I'm like, well, they played 3 creatures, and I definitely don't want them to just sacrifice a C-Note Scout in that case. So it felt better to just put in the Shoot the Sheriff. The other benefit of the Momentum Breaker is that it gets around the Overprotect. But, you know, with Nowhere to Run being in play, the hexproof wouldn't work anyway. So I was kind of banking on that a little bit and decided, you know what, let me be able to remove the specific thing that I want to remove. It's a Screaming Nemesis, right? Or a Tursa or a Wicker Folk or something that's just going to kill me on that, right, when it comes down. So this opening hand is pretty good. I have a Seam Rip, I have an Exercise, and I have 2 of my strongest creatures, right? They play a C-Note Scout. There's a Tersa on top, and then I drew a Hex Mage. So once I drew that Hex Mage, I was actually thinking of playing the Hex Mage first and then bouncing the token with Kieran so that then I could draw a card. I misclicked. Just like in the other game when I accidentally had the land come in tapped in the Izzet Prowess game, I accidentally played this Plains instead of playing the Swamp. I wanted to play the Swamp. But at this point, I was like, you know what? Let me just take this C-Note Scout anyway with the Seam Rip. Because then on the next turn, if it's a Wicker Folk, if it's a Fear of Missing Out, I don't mind exercising either of those creatures, right? So that's why I was like, you know what? Let me just get rid of this thing. They play a Breakout, and in comes Wicker Folk. So that is a fine target for exercise in this case. But turns out I drew another Seam Rip anyway, so now this is even better. I can Seam Rip the Wicker Folk, and I can save my Exercise, and then also I can get Spiteful Hexmage on the field. And I did want to do that instead of saving it for a double spell because I missed a land, and I wanted to potentially draw a card with some Pearl Kieran by bouncing the Cursed Roll token. So seemingly, I was expecting Tursa here, but they didn't do it. They played Breakout instead, and they got a Summon Brynhildr, which is not that scary. You know, they get a little bit of card advantage by being exile top card of the library and stuff, but they didn't attack with it. So now I'm definitely thinking I can exercise this thing because it's an enchantment. It's an enchantment creature. I don't want that in the graveyard, and I also don't want them to keep getting that card advantage from exiling the top card or being able to get the advantage of playing something with haste that wouldn't normally have haste. So missing a land drop there was really unfortunate though, but at least I drew Shoot the Sheriff. So unfortunately, I can't really block with this Hex Mage because I want to be able to bounce the token so that I can draw a card. I still didn't get that 3rd land. So now I'm definitely thinking, man, I might really have to do this, right? I was checking the graveyard there because I wanted to see if I remove Tursa, do they get Delirium? That's what I was checking. So this is a tough spot though. Missing that land again, you know, it felt like I needed to just get this Kieran on the field, bounce this token. Now at least Hexmage can block the Tursa, and then I can guarantee I get my land, and I did. I'm thinking that Spiteful Hexmage can potentially block Tursa. You just have to be careful with what's in the graveyard. So look at this, Dredger's Insight, 4 cards go in, but they still don't have Delirium. And not only that, look at that, it's only sorceries and lands. So I got unlucky because I haven't hit a land drop, but I got lucky in that my opponent really wasn't getting that close to Delirium. Now blocking this Tursa brings them 1 card closer to Delirium. But still, it felt like it wasn't a bad exchange. I still had Shoot the Sheriff to be able to get rid of, you know, whatever comes down, Fear of Missing Out, whatever. I did pause here, like, do I really want to do this block and get them one card closer to Delirium? But I just felt like, you know what, this Hex Mage isn't really doing anything at this point. You know, blocking the Tursa seems like decent enough value. And they do play Fear of Missing Out. Seemingly a good target for Shoot the Sheriff here. It would give them Delirium, but they're close to Delirium anyway. They play a Bushwhack, which still doesn't give them Delirium because they only have sorceries in the graveyard, but drawing Pixie there actually made this very interesting, because now I can potentially hold it to double spell with Cosmic Iron Zenith. However, I can also potentially use it to return one of these Seam Rips. Now, if I return a Seam Rip, they're going to get back the creature that's underneath, right? But that Seam Rip there on the left just has a C-Note Scout under it. Well, if I give them back a C-Note Scout, that's not that bad. And then I can potentially use this Seam Rip to exile that Fear of Missing Out. But more importantly, I can use it to double spell. So what I'm thinking is it's a little bit weird to bounce a Seam Rip and something's underneath. But look, C-Note Scout is not that bad. And I was thinking of kind of maybe I can start with that because I can see what happens with the C-Note when it explores. You know, is my opponent going to get Delirium or not? So it explores, and it's just a land. So now there's no Delirium for the opponent. If I remove the Fear of Missing Out with the Shoot the Sheriff, they get Delirium. However, I can preserve the Seam Rip so that now I can double spell with Sage of the Skies, or double spell with Cosmic Iron Zenith. And most of their creatures have mana value 2 or less, right? So this Wicker Folk comes out. I kind of expected that they might play a Wicker Folk or something like that on this turn, but now I can just exile it with the Seam Rip. The issue is, I didn't get the land. I didn't get the 4th land. So it actually wasn't a bad sequence for me, a bad plan, because look, if this was a 4th land, I could have just played that Seam Rip on this Wicker Folk, double spelled, and then I get 2 Sages. As it is, I just decided to play the Sage without double spelling. They play another Fear of Missing Out, and this actually, I do need to respond to this, because this now that they have Delirium, this Fear of Missing Out is going to cause 2 attack phases, right? So they attack with both the C-Note and the Nurturing Pixie, which I was a little surprised about, but they had an Overprotect. So it felt like I had to block there with the Sage to just gain the life, and if they had any shenanigans, I think, wouldn't I have lost there? I think I would have lost the game there if I didn't block the C-Note. Actually, maybe if I had just blocked with Pixie, I would have lived with 1 life. I don't know. I think I would have lived with 1 life, but now I got the 4th land. Now I can exile the Fear of Missing Out and then double cast the Sage. So it wasn't pretty, and it seems strange to not exile that first Fear of Missing Out, but in the end, that was the right thing to do, because look, I wouldn't have been able to double spell with the Sage, and I wouldn't have been able to exile this Fear of Missing Out. I could have destroyed it with the Shoot the Sheriff, but then again, I wouldn't have been able to double spell. Thankfully, I drew an Optimistic Scavenger. This is perfect. I can double spell with Zenith, and then I can put +1/+1 counters on all of my lifelink flyers, and the opponent scoops. So, a very hectic game there for the Gruul Delirium. You know, it's kind of hard for me to keep up with the commentary because it was happening really fast. But look at that. Mythic, right? Mythic with the Orzhov Midrange here with Nurturing Pixies. 2 very interesting matches between the Izzet Prowess and this very hectic, very tough Gruul Delirium. All right, here's my opening hand for the first game of the 3rd match. And this looks really pretty good. I'm probably not going to play that Hex Mage until I can double spell with Zenith. But I have a great turn 2 play in the Deep Cavern Bat. Also, having the Hex Mage and Kieran in hand is really good because I could potentially bounce the roll token from the Hex Mage to draw a card. My opponent starts with a Veteran Survivor, and I actually forgot what this card did. And I was like, well, okay, they have a Sacred Foundry and this Veteran Survivor, and it's a survival card from Duskmourn. You exile a card from a graveyard and when it's tapped, and if it has 3 or more cards exiled, then it gets +3/+3 in Hexproof. I wasn't too worried about the Hexproof because my Nowhere to Run can get around that, but certainly the +3/+3 could be concerning. Really what I was doing here is I was trying to figure out what deck is my opponent playing here. because Veteran Survivor is not a common card, right? I was like, let me play the bat. Let me see what's going on. At first, I was thinking it could be Boros Equipments, but then look at this. It's actually Naya, because there's a green card there. Another card that I was not familiar with. Look at this. Dryad Militant. I don't think I've seen this card before. But it's in Foundation, so maybe it's a classic card that I just don't know. So now this is very interesting. I wasn't too worried about what I was going to take here because I did have a plan. I was more like, what deck am I playing against? So the reason why I took the Inquisitor is because I knew that they would abrade in response, but I have a second bat. So I'm just going to bat again, and then they waste their abrade on my Deep Cavern Bat. I don't care. See, it's very tempting when you play Deep Cavern Bat to always take the burn spell or the removal spell. Sometimes you don't want to do that because sometimes if you take the other thing that they want, what you're doing is you're forcing them to play the removal spell or the burn spell on the bat. And maybe that's fine because then it's not going to be used on your stronger creature. So look at this. There's a Clarion Conqueror now. And I was thinking, I don't really know what to do here. The Conqueror could potentially be a problem because it's a flyer that blocks my flyers, but it also does die to nowhere to run. So I was still kind of thinking of taking the Inquisitor. It's not necessarily so detrimental if I have to exile the Kirin from my hand and have the Kirin cost 3 mana. That's pretty much what I would do. But I was also thinking, I don't really know what I'm doing on my next turn, and having the option to be able to like play the Hexmage and Kirin on my next turn to bounce the roll token if I need to draw something, you know, just leaving myself a little bit more open. I really wasn't that afraid of this Clarion Conqueror. So they play the Conqueror, and I drew my 4th land. So I'm pretty much expecting to double spell here, but I do just want to carefully consider my options. But it did seem like a good time to double spell. And one thing with this is if I double spell with the Zenith and the Hexmage, I'm going to have to put the roll token on something, right? There's a little specificity with this where you want to put the roll token on a creature that is not that likely to get removed. The reason why is because if you have a Sun Pearl Kirin, like I do, you want to be able to bounce that roll token. So if I put the roll token from the Hexmage on the bat is already a good target for removal. So then not only will I lose my bat, I will also lose my roll token, and now I can't draw a card. So I'm putting it on the human, because the human is very unassuming. And if I play Sun Pearl Kirin, that human is likely to still be on the battlefield when I play Kirin, and then I can draw a card off of the roll token. These little details actually do matter in some matchups. So I drew a Shadowy Backstreet, which really wasn't bad. I can play this, and then I can see what's on top. I can draw a card with Sun Pearl Kirin if I want it, or I can just leave it there. It's Optimistic Scavenger. Beautiful. I don't think there's a better card that could be on top. Bounce the roll token, just like I was explaining. Draw the Scavenger, play it, double spell, and now I have Unholy Annex coming next turn. This is just fantastic. Again, you're seeing the strength of this deck. And look, there's no reason to get in with all my strongest creatures here. I don't care. They just scoop at this point. I don't care if the Hexmage gets double blocked, right? They can't kill the Zenith with a double block. So again, you're really seeing the kind of compounding strength of this deck as long as you use the tools in the right manner. So, very interesting deck that I'm playing against, and admittedly, I don't really know what to do. Because my opponent didn't play that many things. They played some early creatures, they played in a braid, and that's pretty much it. So I have no idea what I'm up against. This is a very, very rogue, unfamiliar deck for me. And that makes sideboarding very difficult. And there's a few points that I want to say about this. Firstly is I was kind of thinking maybe I don't really need to change that much. You know, I did pretty well, which can be true. You don't want to necessarily change your deck drastically, with the trade-off being that you weaken your deck if it's already strong in the matchup. Secondly, however, it is possible that if you won the first game very convincingly, It might not be the case that like, oh, my deck is just so much stronger than theirs. That's actually unlikely. The more likely scenario is they didn't draw very well, you drew extremely well against them, or some combination of those things. So it's not necessarily a fair assumption to say that my deck is just better. Third thing that I want to say is this is why sometimes winning the first game in a best of 3 match too quickly is actually a bit of an issue, because now you don't know how to sideboard, and they saw more of your deck, so they know how to sideboard. That's not to say that I'm going to procrastinate my victories, right? Like, I'm not going to like procrastinate my victories and be like, oh, I'm just not going to win this game. But what I mean is that there are some scenarios when I'm in the first game of a best of 3 match where I'm kind of like, I want to see more of their deck. So this is the opening hand of the second game. As much as I like Unholy Annex, I can't have 3 of them in my opening hand. That does not work. This is much better. I have a Seam Rip, I have a Sheltered by Ghost, Deep Cavern Bat. Plenty of things to respond to what they're doing. And look at this, they actually mulligan to 5, so my opponent's off to a rough start. They play the Veteran Survivor. Seems like a totally fine target for Seam Rip to me. And in my sideboard, again, it was a little bit difficult. I wasn't too sure about the Momentum Breakers. They did seem to have too many creatures to be able to choose whatever they want to get rid of. So I decided to put in the Sheltered by Ghosts instead. That did seem better. So that way I can choose exactly what to get rid of. So now I'm going to Deep Cavern Bat. And this actually was a really good bat. They have an Enduring Innocence and a Voice of Victory. 2 really good targets for the bat. Now the thing is, my opponent only has 2 lands. So they might not necessarily be able to play this Enduring Innocence. And because I have Sheltered by Ghosts, whatever they do play, I can just exile. So I can take the Enduring Innocence right now, and then they can't potentially draw a card off it later or whatever, if they don't play it on the next turn. And then I would take the Voice of Victory with the Sheltered by Ghosts. Or I can just take the Voice of Victory right now, and then they might not have a turn 2 play at all, because they don't have the 3rd land, and then I can just Sheltered by Ghosts the Enduring Innocence at some other time, or whatever else comes down. So this seemed like the better choice. They hit the 3rd land anyway, so it doesn't matter. They get in for damage. Enduring Innocence comes down, and I actually drew a Nowhere to Run, but it's better to play the Sheltered by Ghosts, so that way the Enduring Innocence gets exiled. There's another Nowhere to Run on top. I was really not sure if I wanted this. It seemed like no, like it might be better for me to try to find an Annex. But at the same time, I was like, I'm kind of pulling ahead on board state after this Sheltered by Ghosts. I can seemingly play Cosmic Grand Zenith because they have to top deck a removal spell for it. And it might be possible that I can double spell with that, or it might just be better to just keep removing their creatures, and then I just stay ahead, right? So that's what I was kind of thinking there. I was also thinking it is possible to hold the Sheltered by Ghosts and put it on Zenith instead, because Zenith is a more valuable creature. It will have Ward 2. And also, it will have lifelink. So the bat already has lifelink. I would have had 2 lifelinkers. To that end, I think that might not have been a bad decision, but at the same time, if the Enduring Innocence stays on the field and my opponent plays a 2-mana or a 2-power creature, then they draw a card. A lot of options to consider there. I think the way I did it was pretty good. Look at that, High Noon. Definitely counters my deck. So very good sideboarding from my opponent. Seemingly they have High Noon in their deck more for like the Izzet Prowess or the Izzet Cauldron decks that do typically need to play more than 1 spell, which makes sense, but it's also very effective against my deck. So no reason to not play Nowhere to Run here and just get him for damage, because then I start pulling ahead and I can't double spell anyway. And look at that, Magebane Lizard. So they really sideboarded hard against me here. I can't even Nowhere to Run that thing. So I'm still thinking that, well, I can just attack, and if they block, I'll Nowhere to Run the Magebane Lizard. And then otherwise, they take another 4 damage. So they decide not to block, smarter on their end, but now I'm at 24 and they're at 8. So at least I am still incrementally pulling ahead. So they played a Seam Rip. They're going to target my bat with this. And this is kind of this point where I was like, man, maybe it would have been better to put the Sheltered by Ghosts on the Zenith, like I was thinking. If I had done that, they wouldn't have drawn a card off of the Enduring Innocence because they just played a land that turn. And then I would still have the Enduring Innocence under the Zenith, and they would have just gotten their Voice of Victory back from seam ripping my bat. Since they're going to play Voice of Victory here, it seems like a good idea to just get rid of the Enduring Innocence now so that I can get in for more damage. And I just drew my third Nowhere to Run. That was not a good draw. So really, I was looking for an Annex at this point because I wasn't going to win off the Zenith as long as that High Noon stayed at play. Voice of Victory comes down. And I just drew a land. So now, even though I'm way ahead on life, it does feel like I'm slipping. This game is slipping for me. They can crack the High Noon and destroy my Zenith, but I don't think they'll do that as long as I have multiple cards in hand. So I'm thinking I can just at least get in for damage, and if they block, I'll just remove whatever. If they block with the Magebane Lizard, which they seemingly would do, I would just kill it with a Nowhere to Run. You know, if I just keep removing their creatures, I might be able to get in for that final 5 damage at some point. They do have a Restless Bivik in play, so that is potentially an issue. So certainly gonna remove this Magebane Lizard. And I can't do anything else. So I decided to put a whole bunch of stops on my opponent's turn. Just because I didn't want to... I wanted to bluff that I had something. And in response to that bluff, they are going to play a Lightstall Inquisitor. So now there's no reason to keep these stops on because I don't have anything, right? So they're just going to see that I have a land. Again, even though I'm way ahead on life, this game is certainly slipping away from me. They can activate their Bivik, which they're going to do. Then they can attack. I wasn't sure about attacking with the Voice of Victory here because now Inquisitor is their only blocker, and I can just punch through it with the, or I can it will die to Zenith when I attack with it, but they did it anyway. So now with the High Noon, I was just checking how much mana it costs to activate it, and it costs 5 mana, so seemingly that could take their whole turn. I was concerned about them using it on Zenith, but I figured if I play this Sage of the Skies, I can't double spell anyway, right? So I can't get 2 Sages. But now they might be inclined to High Noon the Sage, which I wouldn't mind, because then I can leave Zenith on there and I could potentially double spell at some point. And if they don't High Noon the Sage, then I can get in for some damage and gain some life. They're going to play Seam Rip, and they're going to Seam Rip my Seam Rip and get back their Veteran Survivor and draw a card. My opponent's playing this really well. Again, I really don't know what this deck is, but they are using what they have to great effect. So I drew a second Zenith, which was actually really good because now, again, if I can bait out that High Noon, I can have a huge turn with 2 Zeniths. That's what I'm hoping here. I was very surprised that they let me get in for that damage, because seemingly they're going to target the Sage with the High Noon anyway. And that is what they're going to do. So if they were going to do that, I was a little bit surprised that they didn't just do it to begin with, because I gained 2 life and they lost 2 life off that. Another Survivor is going to come down. They're going to draw another card. But if I can just get a spell here, then I can make tokens and have plenty of blockers for these Survivors. Just checking to see what's in the graveyard. There's plenty of things for the Survivors to get big. But they're just going to attack with the Voice and the Bivik anyway. So now I can't kill the Bivik with my Zenith. I was a little bit concerned about blocking here because I didn't want them to burn my Zenith with a Torch of Tower or something, but I didn't see it in the last game. I haven't seen it yet this game, so I kind of felt like they might not really have one of those. So I decided to just go for it, and they did not. So look at that. I drew a spell, and not only that, it's Shoot the Sheriff, which is a good response in this case, right? I can play my second Zenith, and then I can get rid of that Voice of Victory. So now, as far as how to do this, you want to put counters on the second trigger, which is actually the first one that appears on the screen. And then for the second one that appears on the screen, it's going to be the first trigger, which is when you want to make the tokens. I think it could have been good to make more tokens here, but at the same time, you know, putting the +1/+1 counter made it so they have to block with all 3 of their creatures. That's another reason why I did that. I didn't necessarily care that one of my Zenith dies. I get to wipe their entire board with 1 creature, so. Razorkin Needlehead, very interesting card. This card doesn't really see much play in Standard. And another Inquisitor, but I don't have anything. This felt like, I don't know if they really should have done that because I don't have anything in hand, but they might not have had another creature necessarily. But they do have a Seam Rip, so they can at least match my board state here with 2 creatures. But now they also don't have the mana to activate the Bivik. Look at that, I finally drew my Annex. So that's really what I was looking for after all this stuff. I knew that Annex would probably be my win condition, with Zenith doing a lot of the legwork already. But really that High Noon just limiting my Zenith for so long, it really felt like I needed the Annex. So first I'm going to attack, see what they do, and they have to block. And I can open up my Ritual Chamber. So now I got my Demon. And they have 3 Seam Rips. They probably don't have another Seam Rip, right? But look at this. Watch what happens. It's an Exercise. So Exercise would have been a great thing for me to sideboard in, but I didn't know that my opponent had so many enchantments. So that's why I didn't put it in. So I do have some options here. I was really debating if I wanted to open up that Annex because my opponent has the Needlehead in play, right? And I'm like, man, I'm going to take 1 damage each time I draw a card. So I was like, am I really going to do this? You know, am I really going to take 2 life from the Annex and 1 damage from Needlehead? And I said yes, because I don't have anything in my hand other than a land. That's not going to win me the game, right? But I do still have 11 life. I do still have a bit of a cushion. So what I do here is I decide to attack with both. Because the Needlehead does not have first strike on my turn. That's what I was checking. So now if they double block the Zenith, which they certainly did, I get them down to 1 life. So 1 single trigger off the Annex wins me the game if I can bounce it with a Pixie or a Kieran or whatever. But look at what I drew. I drew a Seam Rip. So I am just going to Seam Rip their Seam Rip that is holding my bat. Very good draw. Again, the Annex just came in so clutch because I wouldn't, or I guess I would have drawn that Seam Rip off my turn anyway, right? But still, it's a little bit scary, and you're definitely riding the edge, trying to take damage from the Annex, but the value is just so worth it. So I'm not going to attack here because I still have mana up to activate the Bivik. So now as long as my bat survives, and really, it's not even the bat, the Restless Fortress will win me the game as well. Because I can, and look at that, I drew another Annex. So I'm just set, right? I can attack with the Fortress. They lose 2 life off of just that. I can attack with the bat. I can play my next Annex. I don't see any way that I lose this game at this point. I untap, and I'm just gonna get in there. I almost forgot to activate the Fortress first, but the game's over. So very, very entertaining game right there for the 3rd match. Very entertaining, very interesting, and a very unique deck from my opponent. So that wraps this one up, and again, this deck has taken a lot of work, many iterations, but I am very excited and very proud to be able to show this deck to you. I hope that I have provided you with some value, either through showing you the deck list or talking about the cards or discussing the gameplay. If you enjoyed the video, drop me a like, and if you are working on particular brews yourself, then I would like to hear about them, especially if they're brews that involve this kind of Pixie bounce mid-range kind of deck, whether it's Esper or Orzhov. If you are a fan of best of 3 standard content, then consider subscribing to the channel, because I have got many more decks that I want to showcase and a lot more things that I want to share. Hope you have all enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.